Still stuck in that little office, huh? My ex's wife laughed, tossing her diamond bracelet as he smirked beside her. Some people just never rise, she said loud enough for everyone to hear. I smiled, said nothing. Next morning, their $125 million sat on my desk, waiting for my signature. Their faces when they saw me in the Sue's chair. Unforgettable. Every conversation in the Metropolitan Grill stopped when Elise's voice rang out across the restaurant. Still stuck in that little office, huh? Some people just never rise. She stood next to Carson at the bar, twisting her diamond bracelet for emphasis while gesturing at me with her wine glass. The couple at the table next to mine actually set down their forks to watch. A waiter paused mid-stride, holding a tray of drinks that started to tremble. Carson added his own performance, loud enough for the entire dining room, still pushing papers while the rest of us build empires, right, sweetheart? The sweetheart stung worse than everything else, the same endearment he'd used during our marriage. I stood there, my reservation card in hand, feeling 40 pairs of eyes measuring my off-the-rack blazer against Elise's designer dress. What they couldn't see, what would have changed everything, was the email on my phone from Marcus confirming that Carson and Elise's $125 million pharmaceutical acquisition had just landed on my desk at Apex Consulting, waiting for Victoria Blackwood's approval. They didn't know Victoria was me. Before we continue, thank you for being here. If you believe every woman underestimated deserves her moment to rise, hit subscribe. It's free and helps us share more stories like this. Now let's dive in. The hostess touched my elbow gently, her voice barely a whisper. Your table is ready, Ms. Monroe. I followed her through the gauntlet of stairs, each step feeling like a mile. Someone at the bar actually took out their phone, and I heard the distinct sound of a camera shutter. By the time I reached my booth in the corner, my hands were steady but my jaw ached from clenching it. The waiter appeared immediately, professionally ignoring the scene that had just unfolded. I ordered the salmon and a glass of Malbec, then pulled out my phone to read Marcus's email in detail. The acquisition paperwork had been filed 3 months ago, back when Carson and Elise's company, Whitmore Stanton Holdings, thought they were untouchable. The new SEC regulations requiring third-party approval for pharmaceutical deals over $100 million had caught them perfectly. Their lawyers had selected Apex Consulting based on Victoria Blackwood's reputation for swift, discreet approvals. I almost laughed at the irony. For 8 years I'd hidden behind Victoria's name, building an empire while everyone thought I was stuck in middle management. The elaborate deception had started the day Carson told me my business ideas were cute but unrealistic. Now his entire future depended on a signature from a woman he believed was still fetching coffee for real executives. My phone buzzed. Claire texting about tomorrow's lunch plans. My younger sister worried constantly about what she saw as my dead-end career. Just this morning she'd called to lecture me about not taking breaks, about the bags under my eyes that seemed to get darker each week. I'd wanted to tell her about the 3 companies I'd saved before breakfast, about the hostile takeover I'd prevented with a strategy designed at 4 a.m. Instead, I'd promised to try to leave work earlier, knowing I'd break that promise before the day ended. The salmon arrived, perfectly seared and plated with an elegance that felt almost mocking given the circumstances. I cut into it mechanically, barely tasting anything while my mind raced through the implications of Marcus's discovery. The Whitmore Stanton deal was over-leveraged, built on projections that anyone with real experience would recognize as fantasy. They'd need extensive restructuring to avoid bankruptcy within 18 months. My phone lit up with another message from Marcus, pulled their financials. Personal guarantees from both C. Whitmore and E. Whitmore Stanton. They're all in on this. Personal guarantees. Carson had pledged his grandmother's trust fund. Elise had put up her father's real estate holdings as collateral. If this deal failed, and without my intervention they'd lose everything. The restaurant had returned to its normal hum of conversation, though I caught occasional glances in my direction. The couple who'd stopped eating to watch my humiliation were now deep in discussion, probably recounting what they'd witnessed to add drama to their evening. The waiter who'd frozen with his tray was smoothly serving tables again, though he gave my booth a wide berth. I thought about this morning how it had started like every other day for the past 8 years. My alarm at 4:45 a.m., the drive through empty Manhattan streets, the elevator ride to the 42nd floor where my real office waited, The corner suite nobody knew belonged to me. Marcus always arrived first, leaving detailed reports on my desk about companies in crisis, hostile takeovers in progress, executives desperate for help they didn't know came from me. This morning's stack had included Hartley Pharmaceuticals, hemorrhaging $3 million daily while fighting off a hostile fund. I'd spent 2 hours crafting a poison pill defense that would save 4,000 jobs. Their CEO would thank Victoria Blackwood profusely, never knowing she was actually the woman he'd walked past in the lobby, dismissing her as another anonymous worker bee. David Huang had called during my morning coffee, his voice breaking with emotion as he described his daughter Emma getting into Stanford. "She's writing her college essay about you, Ms. Blackwood. About the invisible guardian angel who saved her father's company." I'd listened through my voice modulator, wishing I could accept his repeated invitations to meet in person, to let him shake the hand that had saved Meridian Tech from corporate raiders. But Victoria had to remain a ghost. The moment anyone discovered she was actually Delilah Monroe, divorced, discarded, supposedly stuck in a little office, everything would change. The respect would evaporate. The effectiveness would crumble. So I maintained the lie, even as it meant celebrating every victory alone in my apartment with takeout and wine. The Malbec was good, better than what I usually allowed myself. I'd chosen the Metropolitan Grill tonight as a small reward after a particularly brutal week. 16-hour days had become my normal, but this week had pushed even my limits. 3 hostile defenses, 2 restructurings, and a particularly nasty proxy fight that had required me to work 37 hours straight. Carson and Elise had probably come here to celebrate their impending acquisition, confident that Victoria Blackwood's approval was just a formality. They had no idea they'd just humiliated the person who held their financial future in her hands. The same woman they'd mocked for never rising was about to show them exactly how high she'd climbed. I paid the check and gathered my things, noting how conversations paused as I walked past. The story would spread through their social circles by morning. Poor Delilah Monroe, still stuck in her little office while Carson and Elise built their empire. Let them talk. Let them laugh. Tomorrow afternoon, they'd walk into Apex Consulting's conference room expecting to meet Victoria Blackwood. Instead, they'd find me at the head of the table, CEO nameplate gleaming, their $125 million deal annotated with enough red ink to paint their future crimson. The woman they'd just publicly humiliated would be the one deciding whether their empire stood or fell. The valet stand outside held my coat while I tried to compose myself in the restaurant's mirror. My reflection showed exactly what everyone inside had seen. A woman in a department store blazer, carrying a laptop bag that had seen better days. Someone who clearly didn't belong in Manhattan's power dining scene. I touched up my lipstick with a drugstore brand, not the designer tubes Elise probably kept in her purse, and walked back through the heavy doors. The maitre d' glanced at me with something between sympathy and second-hand embarrassment. "Would you prefer a different table, Ms. Monroe? Perhaps something more private?" He meant well, but moving tables would look like retreat. I shook my head and walked back through the main dining room, where conversations had resumed but eyes still tracked my movement. Carson and Elise had shifted from the bar to a prominent table near the windows. Their group now expanded to include 2 other couples I recognized from our old social circle. Bradley Stevenson from Goldman Sachs raised his martini in mock salute when he saw me. His wife Jennifer, who used to call me for advice during her divorce, suddenly found her menu fascinating. "Delilah's here," Elise announced to their table, her voice carrying that particular frequency designed to travel. "We were just talking about the old Yale days. Remember when you were going to revolutionize corporate consulting?" She laughed, and the sound tinkled like breaking glass. God, we were all so naive back then. I stopped at their table because walking past would have seemed cowardly. Up close, I could see the careful architecture of Elise's appearance. The highlights that cost more than my monthly utilities, the injectable treatments that kept her forehead unnaturally smooth, the dress that whispered money with every thread. Carson's watch was new, a Patek Philippe that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries. "Hello, everyone." My voice came out steadier than expected. "Enjoying your evening?" Bradley's wife Jennifer finally looked up, her expression carefully neutral. "Delilah, it's been forever. How are you?" Before I could answer, Carson jumped in. "Delilah's still at the same place, aren't you? What was it, administrative services?" He turned to Bradley. "She handles paperwork for one of those small consulting shops downtown." Very stable. Very predictable. The word predictable hung in the air like a diagnosis. Bradley shifted uncomfortably while his wife studied her water glass. The other couple, names I'd forgotten, exchanged glances that suggested they'd rather be anywhere else. It pays the bills, I said simply. Elise's laugh was bright and sharp. Oh, Delilah, always so practical. Though I suppose someone has to do the grunt work, right? Not everyone can be a visionary. She touched Carson's arm possessively. We were just telling Bradley about our new acquisition. Pharmaceutical sector. 9 figures. 8 figures, Carson corrected quickly, but the damage was done. I'd seen the actual number in Marcus's email. $125 million. The need to exaggerate to perform success like a Broadway show told me everything about their insecurity. How wonderful for you both, I managed, though the words tasted like ash. You know, Elise continued, twisting her diamond bracelet so it caught the light from every angle. I was telling Jennifer earlier that we should all be grateful for our journeys. Some of us build empires, some of us support them. Both roles are important. The condescension dripped like honey, sweet and suffocating. Jennifer looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair. Bradley cleared his throat and mumbled something about needing to check with the babysitter. Absolutely, I agreed, surprising them with my calm. Everyone plays their part. Carson leaned back in his chair, the same leather squeaking sound I remembered from our dining room set, the one I'd kept after the divorce because he hadn't wanted it. You know what I always admired about you, Delilah? Your acceptance of limitations. So many people waste their lives chasing impossible dreams. But you found your level and stayed there. There's wisdom in that. Found my level. The phrase echoed in my skull while I stood there, my phone burning in my pocket with the knowledge of what was coming. Every instinct screamed to tell them the truth right then, to wipe those smug expressions off their faces with 3 simple words. I'm Victoria Blackwood. But timing was everything in hostile takeovers, and this was just another kind of acquisition. That's one way to look at it, I said. The waiter appeared with their appetizers, giving me an exit. Enjoy your dinner, I said, already turning away. Oh, Delilah, Elise called after me, loud enough for surrounding tables to hear. If you ever need a reference or anything for a better position, don't hesitate to ask. Carson has connections everywhere now. I paused, turned back with a smile that probably looked genuine from their angle. That's very generous, Elise. I'll keep that in mind. Walking to my booth felt like navigating a minefield of stares and whispers. The young couple from earlier had progressed to dessert, but they watched me pass with the intensity of people witnessing a car accident. The older businessman had returned to his phone, but I caught him glancing up as I sat down. My salmon had gone cold during the encounter, the elegant presentation now looking sad and congealed. The waiter appeared immediately, offering to have the kitchen prepare a fresh plate. I accepted, grateful for small kindnesses in a night full of calculated cruelty. While waiting, I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the full acquisition documentation Marcus had forwarded. Every page revealed another layer of Carson and Elise's desperation disguised as confidence. They'd over-leveraged everything. Properties, trust funds, even future inherited assets that weren't technically theirs yet. The personal guarantees were ironclad, written by lawyers who probably assumed anyone signing them understood the massive risk involved. A text from Marcus appeared, reviewed the subsidiary contracts. They're betting everything on FDA fast-track approval that statistically won't happen. Want me to prepare the full risk assessment for tomorrow. When they'd walk into my conference room expecting to meet a ghost named Victoria Blackwood. When the woman they'd just performed this elaborate mockery for would hold their signatures in her hand like a sword over their necks. Prepare everything, I typed back. Full documentation. Every flaw, every risk, every reason this deal needs restructuring. The new salmon arrived, perfectly prepared and presented with an apologetic flourish from the waiter. This time I tasted it, letting the richness ground me in the present moment. At Carson and Elise's table, laughter erupted at something Bradley said. The sound washed over me without touching me like rain on glass. The taste of salmon lingered as I signed the check, my hand steady despite the tremor I felt building in my chest. The Metropolitan Grill's granite bar caught the light as I stood to leave, its swirled pattern identical to the kitchen island Carson and I had picked out together at a warehouse in Queens. We'd argued over the price for an hour before I'd finally convinced him it was an investment in our future. Now that same pattern mocked me from across the restaurant where he sat with Elise, planning acquisitions with money that wasn't quite theirs yet. I gathered my laptop bag and started toward the exit, taking the long way to avoid their table. But my eyes betrayed me, drawn to that granite surface where the bartender was mixing cocktails. 7 years ago, I'd spread my entire business plan across our matching granite island, color-coded folders and projection charts covering every inch. Carson had been eating Lucky Charms, the marshmallow kind he insisted on buying despite being 32 years old. A drop of milk had landed on my executive summary, and I'd quickly dabbed it away while continuing my pitch about hostile takeover defenses. Think about it, I'd said, my voice vibrating with conviction. Companies lose billions every year to hostile raids. Not because they're failing but because they're vulnerable. We could build a firm that specializes in defense strategies. Make ourselves indispensable to every mid-sized company in America. He'd set down his spoon slowly, the way someone might put down a weapon they decided not to use. His expression wasn't angry or dismissive, it was worse. He looked at me the way you'd look at a child who'd just announced they were going to be an astronaut. Sweetheart, he'd said, and even then the endearment had felt patronizing, you're brilliant at executing other people's visions. You have an incredible eye for detail, you're organized, you work harder than anyone I know. But creating something from nothing? That's a different skill set entirely. I'd stood there holding my laser pointer, which suddenly felt ridiculous in my hand, like a toy. You don't think I can do it? I think you should stick to what you're good at. There's no shame in being exceptional support. Not everyone needs to be the visionary. The memory burned fresh as I stepped out into the November air, pulling my coat tighter against the wind. The valet offered to call me a cab, but I needed to walk, needed the cold to chase away the ghost of that morning and what followed. 2 months after that kitchen island conversation, Carson had attended his father's charity gala without me. I'd been home with the flu, fever so high I could barely lift my head. Go without me, I'd insisted, not wanting him to miss the networking opportunity. He'd kissed my forehead, promised to come home early, and left smelling of the cologne I'd bought him for Christmas. He came back at 3 a.m. and he was different. Not drunk, not disheveled, just altered. Like someone had adjusted his frequency to a channel I couldn't receive. He sat on the edge of our bed, still in his tuxedo, staring at his phone with an expression I'd never seen before. Good party? I'd asked through my congestion. Yeah, it was enlightening. Over the next 2 weeks, Elise Whitmore's name began appearing in his sentences like scattered breadcrumbs leading somewhere I didn't want to follow. Elise thought the market was about to shift. Elise's father had connections in Shanghai. Elise understood what it took to really make it in this city. She gets it, he'd said one night over dinner, pushing his food around his plate. The scale of ambition required. Not everyone does. The subtext was clear. I didn't get it. I was thinking too small, dreaming too safely. My hostile takeover defense firm was a quaint idea, like a lemonade stand compared to the real estate empire Elise had been born into. Walking down Madison Avenue now, I passed the building where our apartment had been. 5th floor, corner unit, view of a small park where dogs played in the mornings. I'd found the divorce papers on that granite island 6 months after the gala, arranged neatly next to a box of my things he'd already started packing. He'd used his Yale Law connections to get everything done quickly, efficiently. Half my savings evaporated in legal fees. The apartment was too expensive to maintain alone. I'd spent my last night there sitting on the floor because he'd already arranged for the furniture to be moved to his new place with Elise. The wine glasses were gone, so I'd drunk a bottle of Corner Store Merlot from a coffee mug I'd found in the back of a cabinet. My tears had fallen onto the yellow legal pad where I was sketching out the structure for Apex Consulting, smearing the ink but not the determination behind it. At 2 a.m. in my new one-bedroom apartment that smelled like the previous tenant's cats, I'd given birth to Victoria Blackwood. Not in celebration but in desperation. The incorporation documents glowed on my laptop screen as I selected Operations Manager from the drop-down menu for my own role. So would be Victoria Blackwood, a woman who existed only in paperwork and carefully modulated phone calls. I'd spent the rest of that night practicing her voice, recording myself reading the same paragraph over and over until I found the right tone, confident, slightly British, The kind of accent that suggested old money and Ivy League without saying either explicitly. My throat had been raw by sunrise, but Victoria was ready to meet the world. The wind picked up as I turned onto my street, carrying the smell of rain and exhaust. In my pocket, my phone buzzed with another text from Marcus, but I didn't check it. I knew what tomorrow would bring. Carson and Elise would walk into my conference room expecting to meet the legendary Victoria Blackwood, and instead they'd find me. The woman Carson had dismissed at our kitchen island. The one he'd left with divorce papers and an empty apartment. The one Elise had just performed for like a circus act at the Metropolitan Grill. They thought I'd been stuck in place all these years, but I'd been building something they couldn't see. Every dismissal, every condescending smile, every public humiliation had been another brick in the foundation of something that would outlast their over-leveraged ambitions. Victoria Blackwood had been my chrysalis, and tomorrow I would finally emerge. My key turned in the apartment lock just after midnight, but sleep wouldn't come. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment from the restaurant, until my alarm buzzed at 4:45 a.m. The city was still dark as I drove to the office, but my mind was already racing ahead to the meeting that would change everything. Marcus was waiting in the 42nd floor lobby when the elevator doors opened, holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing that expression that meant he'd discovered something important. He'd been with Apex for 6 months, hired after I'd saved his previous employer from a particularly vicious hostile takeover. Sharp, intuitive, and most importantly, discreet. "We need to talk," he said, following me into my office. I hung my coat and settled behind my desk, noting the unusual tension in his shoulders. "What's on your mind?" He set down a folder thick with printouts, spreading them across my desk like evidence in a court case. Financial signatures, dated emails, incorporation documents, timeline analyses. My stomach tightened as I recognized what he'd compiled. "Hartley Industries," he said, tapping one sheet. The defense strategy was filed at 3:47 a.m. by Victoria Blackwood. "Security footage shows only you in the building at that time." He pulled out another page. "Brennan Steele. Victoria's digital signature originated from IP address 192.168.1.42, your office computer. Not the separate workstation you claim she uses. More papers. More connections. 6 months of careful observation laid out in black and white. The voice modulation software on your system. The power of attorney documents with identical legal phrasing. The fact that Victoria Blackwood has never been photographed, never attended a conference, never been seen by anyone." He paused, meeting my eyes. "You're Victoria Blackwood." The silence stretched between us. I could lie, deflect, maintain the fiction. Or I could trust the man who'd spent 6 months collecting evidence and chosen to confront me privately rather than expose me publicly. "When did you know?" I asked quietly. "Suspected after 3 weeks. Confirmed it after 3 months. Spent the last 3 months trying to understand why." He leaned forward, genuine curiosity replacing any hint of accusation. "You've built something incredible here. Why hide behind a ghost?" I pulled out the operations manager nameplate from my drawer, setting it next to my hidden CEO version. "Because ghosts don't have histories. They don't have ex-husbands who dismissed their ideas or social circles that decided they weren't worth knowing. Victoria Blackwood gets respect because she's a mystery. Delilah Monroe would get picked apart because she's real." Marcus absorbed this, nodding slowly. "The hostile takeover we prevented last month. Davidson Pharmaceuticals. Their board thanked Victoria profusely. While I sat in the corner taking notes, and they never looked at me twice. That's actually genius." A grin spread across his face, the same one he wore when we'd cracked a particularly complex defensive strategy. "You weaponized their dismissal of you." From that night forward, everything changed. Marcus became my true lieutenant, the only person who knew both sides of my identity. We'd work until 3 in the morning sometimes, the conference table buried under financial reports and legal documents, empty containers from his mother's restaurant scattered between laptops and calculators. "Boss," he'd say, always with that knowing grin, "Victoria's getting a call from Tokyo in 10 minutes. Need the voice modulator." We developed a rhythm. I'd handle the strategy while he managed the logistics of maintaining my dual identity. When we saved Excelsior Biotech from a hostile fund that had already acquired 30% of their shares, he brought champagne to celebrate. To Victoria, he said, raising his glass with a theatrical wink, and to Delilah. May they both continue to terrify corporate raiders. It was the first time in years someone had celebrated both versions of me, acknowledged that they were both real, both valuable. 3 months into our partnership, Marcus mentioned his mother's restaurant was struggling. Rising rents in Queens were crushing her dream, the landlord demanding 40% more despite 12 years of perfect payments. He mentioned it casually over cold pizza at midnight, not asking for help but unable to hide his worry. Send me the lease agreement, I said. Delilah, I wasn't asking. Send it. I spent the weekend restructuring her lease through a shell company Victoria controlled, negotiating with her landlord's management company which, coincidentally, I'd saved from bankruptcy 2 years earlier. They owed Victoria Blackwood a favor. The new lease locked in reasonable rates for the next decade with built-in protections against arbitrary increases. When Marcus found out, he stood in my office doorway struggling for words. My mom, she's crying. She made you empanadas. Enough for an army. She wants to know who to thank. Tell her it was a friend who believes in protecting good businesses. He crossed the room and hugged me, brief, professional but genuine. This is why you hide, I said when he pulled back. So we can help without creating obligations. Without people feeling they owe us their gratitude or loyalty. Or maybe, he said, you hide because you're scared of being seen as powerful. The observation hit closer to truth than I wanted to admit. 13 companies saved from hostile takeovers, 23 successful restructurings, billions in preserved market value, all credited to Victoria Blackwood while Delilah Monroe went home to microwave dinners and empty celebrations. Industry magazines ran feature articles about Victoria's mysterious genius. Forbes speculated about her background. The Wall Street Journal called her the ghost in the machine of American business. Meanwhile, I sat alone in my apartment, reading about my own achievements as if they belonged to someone else. You should reveal yourself, Marcus suggested one evening as we reviewed quarterly reports. Take credit for what you've built. I showed him my laptop screen, not the bank statements showing Apex's success, but the comments section under a recent article about women in business. The vitriol directed at female CEOs who'd built their companies from nothing. The accusations of sleeping their way to success. The detailed dissections of their divorces, their appearances, their personal lives. A divorced woman with no connections, no family money, no Ivy League MBA? They'd tear me apart. Question every deal, investigate every success, assume I had help or got lucky or worse. Victoria Blackwood's mystery is her power. The moment she becomes Delilah Monroe, that power evaporates. Marcus didn't argue, but I saw something shift in his expression. Understanding mixed with frustration at a world that made hiding the smartest strategy for someone like me. We stayed in my office until nearly 10 that night, Marcus and I, analyzing market patterns and discussing defensive strategies for 3 other clients facing raids. The weight of keeping secrets had become familiar over the years, but tonight it felt different. Tomorrow would change everything, though Marcus didn't know that yet. I was packing up my laptop when he suddenly stopped mid-sentence, staring at his tablet screen. His fingers moved quickly across the surface, zooming in on something, his expression shifting from curiosity to disbelief. Delilah. His voice carried an edge I'd rarely heard. You need to see this. He turned the tablet toward me and there it was, a confidential SEC filing from Whitmore Stanton Holdings. The numbers jumped out immediately. $125 million for the acquisition of Pharmalink Industries. My eyes found the critical clause buried on page 3. Third-party verification required by an approved consulting firm specializing in pharmaceutical sector analysis. Keep reading, Marcus said, his excitement barely contained. The law firm's recommendation was typed in standard legal formatting. We recommend engaging Apex Consulting Group, specifically requesting oversight from Victoria Blackwood given her unparalleled track record in pharmaceutical acquisitions. The tablet trembled slightly in Marcus's hand, though whether from excitement or the magnitude of what we were looking at I couldn't tell. They filed this 3 months ago, he said. Before last night's restaurant performance. They have no idea Victoria Blackwood is you. I sank into my chair, the leather creaking under the sudden weight of possibility. Carson and Elise had just placed their entire future in my hands without knowing it. The same hands they'd dismissed as only good for pushing paper. The irony was so perfect, so complete that laughter bubbled up from somewhere deep in my chest. Not bitter or forced, but genuine. The first real laugh since Carson had walked out 7 years ago. They just handed us their future, Marcus said, already pulling up additional screens on his tablet. This is poetic, I finished. We spent the next 4 hours dissecting every page of their proposal. Marcus pulled the full financial disclosures while I analyzed the deal structure. What we found was worse than amateur. It was reckless. They'd leveraged everything on projections that assumed best-case scenarios at every turn. Look at this, I said, highlighting a section on page 47. Personal guarantees from both parties. Marcus leaned over my shoulder reading the fine print. Carson pledged assets from the Whitmore Family Trust. That's his grandmother's money, she's 93 years old. And here, I pointed to another clause, Elise's father co-signed using his real estate holdings as collateral. Half of Connecticut's commercial property according to what they love to brag about. The structure was a house of cards built in a hurricane. They'd borrowed against future inheritance, pledged assets they didn't fully own, and bet everything on FDA fast-track approval that statistically had a 12% chance of happening. Without proper restructuring, the deal would collapse within 18 months, taking their entire financial ecosystem with it. When do they expect to meet Victoria? I asked. Marcus checked the scheduling system. Their lawyers requested tomorrow, 2 p.m. Conference room A. Tomorrow. Less than 18 hours away. I stood and walked to the window looking out at the city lights below. Each light represented someone's ambition, someone's dream, someone's carefully constructed facade. Tomorrow mine would finally fall away. We need to prepare the conference room, I said, turning back to Marcus. This needs to be perfect. We spent the next hour transforming the space into a carefully orchestrated stage. I adjusted the lighting controls myself, making their sides slightly harsher. Not enough to be obvious, but sufficient to create subtle discomfort. The executive chairs on our side were positioned for maximum authority while theirs were set just slightly lower, an old negotiation trick that created unconscious hierarchy. The smart glass, Marcus said, gesturing to the wall panel. We can keep it opaque from their side. You could watch them arrive. Do it. He programmed the glass while I unwrapped my real nameplate, the one I'd never displayed. Delilah Monroe so gleamed in brass letters that had never seen daylight in this building. Marcus placed it at the head of the table with ceremonial precision. What about Victoria's? He asked. She retires tomorrow. We tested the wall display 3 times, ensuring the presentation would load instantly when needed. 8 years of victories, billions in saved value, testimonials from CEOs who'd never known my real name, all ready to appear at the touch of a button. By the time I got home it was past 2 in the morning. Sleep felt impossible. I lay in bed, my mind racing through scenarios and possibilities. The ceiling fan turned slowly above me, and in its rhythm, I heard echoes of every dismissal that had brought me here. Elise's voice from the restaurant. Still stuck in that little office, huh? Carson from 7 years ago. Stick to what you're good at, sweetheart. His father at that horrible dinner. Some people are meant to lead, others to follow. My college advisor suggesting I consider more realistic career goals. Each memory sharpened my resolve. Tomorrow wasn't just about revealing my success. It was about shattering their entire worldview. The woman they'd publicly humiliated held the power to save or destroy their financial future. The secretary they'd mocked would sit in the CEO's chair while they begged for approval. I got up and walked to my closet, running my fingers along the garments inside. Tomorrow called for something specific. Not the understated blazers I wore as operations manager, not the invisible uniform of someone trying not to be noticed. Tomorrow demanded presence. The Saint Laurent suit hung in protective plastic, purchased with my first major success but never worn. Navy blue so dark it was nearly black, with lines that whispered authority. I laid it out on the chair, then returned to bed. 3 hours until dawn. 15 hours until they walked into my conference room. The anticipation thrummed through my veins like electricity. Victoria Blackwood had served her purpose, protecting me while I built an empire in shadow. But tomorrow Delilah Monroe would step into the light, and Carson and Elise would finally understand that the woman they'd dismissed had been holding their strings all along. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Everything's ready. This is going to be legendary. I didn't reply. There were no words for what tomorrow would bring. Only the quiet certainty that everything, every insult, every dismissal, every moment of being overlooked, had led to this perfect convergence. The morning arrived gray and heavy with approaching rain. I dressed slowly, methodically, each piece of clothing feeling like armor being fitted for battle. The Saint Laurent suit fit perfectly, its dark fabric catching light in ways that suggested depth and authority. I arrived at the office at noon, giving myself 2 hours to prepare mentally for what was about to unfold. At 1:45 p.m. I positioned myself in the observation room adjacent to conference room A, watching through the smart glass that remained opaque from their side. Marcus stood ready by the door, his expression carefully neutral despite the electricity I knew he felt. The conference table gleamed under the adjusted lighting, my CO nameplate catching the light at the head like a crown waiting to be claimed. They arrived at 1:55 p.m., 5 minutes early, clearly wanting to project punctuality and professionalism. Carson entered first and my breath caught for just a moment. He was wearing the Hermes tie I'd bought him for our 5th anniversary, the one I'd saved for 3 months to afford. He had no idea, of course. To him it was just another expensive accessory in his collection. Elise followed, her Louboutins announcing her presence with sharp clicks against the marble floor. She wore cream-colored Chanel, her hair pulled back in a style that probably cost more than most people's car payments. The diamond bracelet from last night caught the light with every gesture, a reminder of her performance at the Metropolitan Grill. Their legal team filed in behind them, 2 senior partners from Cromwell and Associates, a CFO whose nervous energy radiated across the room, and an assistant who immediately began arranging documents with practiced efficiency. They moved like a choreographed unit, expensive suits and leather briefcases creating an atmosphere of established power. "Miss Blackwood will be with you shortly," Marcus said, his voice carrying just the right tone of professional courtesy. "Can I offer anyone coffee? Water?" "Just get her in here," Carson said, not rudely but with the casual dismissiveness of someone used to being obeyed. "We have a 4 o'clock in Midtown." Through the glass I watched him check his Rolex. Another gift from me, though this one from his birthday 6 years ago. The irony of him using my gifts while preparing to meet the woman he'd dismissed made my fingers tighten around my portfolio. Elise settled into her chair with practiced elegance, adjusting her bracelet in what I recognized as a nervous habit. "I've heard Victoria Blackwood is particular about her entrances," she said to the lawyer beside her. "Some kind of power play, apparently. Worth it if she signs off quickly," the CFO muttered, shuffling through his papers. "We need this done yesterday." Marcus caught my eye through the glass, a subtle nod indicating it was time. I took one deep breath, feeling 8 years of preparation crystallize into this single moment. The door handle was cool under my palm. At precisely 2:03 p.m. I pushed open the door. The sound wasn't loud, but in the expectant silence of the conference room, it might as well have been thunder. I walked in with measured steps, my heels creating a rhythm against the floor. Every eye tracked my movement, confusion already beginning to cloud their expressions. I crossed to the head of the table, taking my time, letting them absorb the quality of my suit, the confidence in my posture, the deliberate way I set down my portfolio. Only then did I take my seat and look directly at each of them in turn. "Good afternoon," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the room. "I'm Delilah Monroe, CEO of Apex Consulting Group." The words landed in sequence, each one a small explosion in the carefully constructed reality they'd brought with them. Carson's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips, the liquid trembling slightly from the sudden halt. His mouth opened but no sound emerged. Elise's transformation was more visceral. Her perfectly lined eyes widened, the carefully applied mascara making them appear almost cartoon-like in their shock. Her hand moved unconsciously to her throat, fingers finding the pearl necklace there as if it might provide some anchor to reality. "This is..." Carson started, stopped, tried again. "This is..." But the sentence wouldn't complete. His brain was trying to reconcile the woman from last night, the one he'd called sweetheart with such condescension, with the CEO sitting before him. Their CFO began frantically flipping through his notes, pages rustling like autumn leaves, as if somewhere in those documents he might find a different reality. One of the lawyers cleared his throat, started to speak, then thought better of it. "I believe you're expecting to meet with Victoria Blackwood," I continued, allowing myself the smallest smile. Victoria has been my professional alias for the past 8 years. A necessary fiction that allowed me to build this company without the burden of certain preconceptions. I nodded to Marcus, who touched his tablet. The wall display behind me illuminated with Apex Consulting's credentials. The numbers scrolled past like a verdict being read. 15 years of documented victories, $2.3 billion in protected market value, a client list that included several Fortune 500 companies, testimonials from CEOs who had never known they were thanking Delilah Monroe. Elise actually gasped, a small, sharp sound that she immediately tried to suppress. Her face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied foundation. "You're lying," Carson finally managed, though his voice lacked any conviction. "This is some kind of what?" I interrupted smoothly, pulling their contract from my portfolio. "Joke? Mistake? I assure you the only mistake here is in your acquisition structure." I opened the document, its pages annotated with red ink like a professor's corrections on a failing student's paper. My fingers found the first flag without looking. "Your valuation of PharmaLink is inflated by 30%, I said, sliding the page across the table. "You're basing it on projections that assume FDA fast-track approval, which historically has a 12% success rate for similar compounds." Carson reached for the page with unsteady hands. I pulled out the next section. "Your debt structure," I continued, showing them the calculations, "collapses in 18 months under any scenario except perfect execution, which, given the market volatility in pharmaceutical acquisitions, is statistically impossible." The CFO had stopped searching his documents and was now staring at my annotations, his face growing paler with each line he read. "And these," I said, tapping the signature pages with my pen, "these personal guarantees you've both signed? They'll bankrupt you when this deal fails. Carson, you've pledged your grandmother's trust fund. Elise, your father's real estate holdings are on the line." "The market dynamics," Carson started, grasping for his usual corporate speak. I was ready. Marcus handed me a tablet and I pulled up 5 years of comparable acquisitions, their failure rates highlighted in stark red. "Would you like to discuss the Brennan acquisition? Similar structure, failed in 14 months. Or perhaps the Steinberg deal. They're currently under federal investigation." Elise hadn't spoken since my entrance. She sat frozen, her world visibly rewriting itself behind her eyes, the diamond bracelet she twisted so proudly last night now seeming to weigh down her wrist like a shackle. The senior lawyer from Cromwell and Associates cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of a meeting that had spiraled beyond recognition. "Perhaps we should review the terms more carefully," he suggested, though his voice carried no authority against the weight of evidence I'd laid before them. I pulled out another folder, this one containing case studies of every failed pharmaceutical acquisition that had followed their model. The Harriman deal collapsed after 11 months. The Vega acquisition, federal investigation within 6 months. Morrison Pharmaceuticals, bankruptcy in 14 months. I placed each file down like playing cards in a losing hand. "You're not following a playbook for success. You're following a manual for destruction." Carson's hands trembled as he reached for the Harriman file. His face had gone gray, aging 5 years in 5 minutes. "These weren't. We had different projections," he stammered. "Based on what data?" I asked, pulling up their financial models on my tablet. "Your growth assumptions require market conditions that haven't existed since 2019. Your regulatory timeline ignores 3 pending FDA policy changes. Your competitor analysis doesn't even mention the Korean pharmaceutical giant that's about to enter this exact market segment." The CFO's breathing had become audible, short gasps as each revelation landed. One of the lawyers was furiously typing on his phone, probably alerting senior partners about the disaster unfolding. Elise finally found her voice, though it came out strangled and small. "How long?" "How long what?" I asked, though I knew exactly what she meant. "How long have you been Victoria Blackwood?" I leaned back in my chair, allowing myself a moment to savor the question. 8 years. 8 years of being underestimated, dismissed, mocked. 8 years of building an empire while people like you assumed I was fetching coffee and filing papers. Her face crumbled, the careful makeup unable to hide the devastation underneath. The woman who'd performed my humiliation for an audience last night now sat before me, understanding that she'd been dancing for the very person who held her future. "The trust fund," Carson whispered, his voice cracking. My grandmother's trust fund. She's 93. It's all she has for her care facility. Then you should have thought about that before leveraging it on fantasies, I said, though I pulled out my revised contract. I've restructured your deal. It's survivable, barely, but only if you follow my terms exactly. Marcus handed out copies of my revision, 40 pages of corrections that transformed their reckless gamble into something that might actually work. They'd still make money, just not the fortune they'd imagined. More importantly, they'd avoid bankruptcy. Sign it, I said simply. Or walk away and watch everything collapse within 18 months. The room fell silent except for the sound of pages turning. Carson's signature, when it finally came, was shaky and unrecognizable. Elise signed without looking at me, her hand trembling so badly the pen nearly slipped from her fingers. We're done here, I said, standing. They filed out in silence, their earlier confidence replaced by the shell-shocked expressions of people who'd just survived a catastrophe. 3 days later, Marcus showed me his phone over morning coffee. Someone at the Metropolitan Grill had recorded Elise's mockery on Thursday night. The video was everywhere. Twitter, LinkedIn, TikTok. Still stuck in that little office, huh? Some people just never rise, played on repeat over dramatic music. The comment sections were brutal. Did you see who she was talking to? One commenter wrote. That's Delilah Monroe, the CEO of Apex Consulting. She's worth more than everyone in that restaurant combined. The hashtag some people never rise became ironic overnight, attached to stories of successful women who'd been underestimated. Business Insider ran a feature. The secretary who was actually a shadow CEO. Forbes picked it up, then the Wall Street Journal. Carson's board of directors called an emergency meeting within 48 hours. Marcus had a contact there who fed us updates. They were furious about the over-leveraged deal, the risk to the company's reputation, the viral embarrassment. The vote of no confidence was unanimous. Elise's father gave an interview to the Wall Street Journal 5 days after our meeting. My daughter's recklessness nearly cost our family everything, he said, distancing himself with surgical precision. I've removed her from all family business operations effective immediately. Their social media accounts disappeared within a week. Elise's Instagram, with its carefully curated lifestyle posts, went dark. Carson's LinkedIn, previously updated daily with thought leadership posts, showed no activity. The divorce filing came through Marcus's network 3 months later. They fought over assets that no longer existed, each blaming the other for the catastrophe. Their lawyers sent me letters requesting professional courtesy in not discussing the details publicly. I filed them in a folder labeled simply past and never responded. But I didn't want to live in their destruction. That same week, I launched the Apex initiative, transforming the energy of revenge into something constructive. The program would fund women entrepreneurs who'd been dismissed, overlooked, or told they weren't capable of building something significant. The first applicant arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. Sarah Chin, 34, with a biotech startup and exhausted eyes. She'd been turned down by 16 investors, most of whom suggested she find a male co-founder to add credibility. They said my idea was too ambitious for someone with my background, she told me, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. I wrote her a check for $200,000 on the spot. Ambition is exactly what we're funding here. Within 6 months, Sarah's company had 3 patents pending and a partnership with Johns Hopkins. She sent me a photo of her new office. A real office, not hidden, not small, with her name on the door in gold letters. Every month brought more women like Sarah. Engineers told they were better suited for support roles. Doctors with revolutionary treatment ideas dismissed as too risky. Consultants whose strategies were stolen by male colleagues who received the credit. I funded them all, but more than money, I gave them what I'd never had. Someone who believed them without requiring them to prove themselves first. They didn't need to hide behind fictional names or pretend to be less than they were. Carson took a position as a senior associate at his old firm, essentially starting over at 41. The same colleagues he'd once outranked now gave him assignments. Elise moved to her family's estate in Connecticut, disappearing from New York's social scene entirely. The months that followed passed in a blur of expansion and purpose. Each morning brought new applications to the Apex initiative, stories of brilliant women whose ideas had been dismissed by people who couldn't see past their own limitations. I read every application personally, remembering my own nights above that Thai restaurant, building something from nothing while the world assumed I was nothing. 6 months after the confrontation with Carson and Elise, Marcus suggested something I'd been avoiding. "We should celebrate," he said one afternoon, setting a proposal on my desk. 10 years since you incorporated Apex. Even if only you knew about the first 2. The idea felt foreign. I'd never celebrated my victories, just moved on to the next challenge. But Marcus was right. The women we'd funded through the initiative deserved to see what was possible. The CEOs we'd saved deserved to gather in triumph rather than crisis. We rented the ballroom at the Meridian Hotel, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. The invitation list grew beyond what I'd imagined. Every company we'd saved, every entrepreneur we'd funded, partners who'd believed in Victoria Blackwood without ever seeing her face. 300 people who'd been part of this journey knowingly or not. The night of the gala, I stood before my mirror adjusting the neckline of my dress. Deep emerald green, nothing like the grays and blacks I'd worn in hiding. My nameplate for the evening read simply Delilah Monroe, founder and CEO. No qualifiers, no apologies, no ghost names anymore. The ballroom hummed with conversation when I arrived. Chandelier light caught on champagne glasses and jewelry, but more importantly, it illuminated faces I recognized from years of quiet victories. David Huang was there with his daughter Emma, now a sophomore at Stanford. Sarah Chin had brought her entire team, their startup logo proud on their name tags. Marcus stood near the podium, greeting guests with the easy confidence of someone who'd helped build something meaningful. When he saw me, he raised his glass slightly, a private acknowledgement of how far we'd come from that night he'd confronted me with printouts and questions. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began once everyone had gathered, "I want to tell you about the most elaborate magic trick in corporate history. For 8 years, a woman built an empire while convincing the world she didn't exist. Tonight we celebrate not just Apex Consulting's success, but the revelation of the brilliant mind behind it all." He raised his champagne glass higher. "To Delilah Monroe, the woman who showed us that power doesn't need to shout. It just needs to deliver." The applause felt strange, washing over me like warm water after years of cold silence. Rebecca Chin, whose biotech startup we'd saved from a hostile takeover, took the microphone next. She spoke about second chances, about doors that only opened because someone believed in the impossible. Then Sarah stood, her voice nervous but determined. "Ms. Monroe taught me something crucial," she said, gripping the podium. "The best revenge against those who dismiss you isn't destroying them. It's building something so undeniable that their dismissal becomes irrelevant. Every woman funded by the Apex Initiative is living proof that being underestimated is just another form of competitive advantage." I was processing the weight of those words when I noticed movement near the entrance. Claire stood in the doorway, still in her teaching clothes, her face a mixture of confusion and recognition. She'd seen the news coverage then. The story had been everywhere for weeks after the video went viral. I excused myself and made my way through the crowd. She watched me approach, her expression cycling through surprise, hurt, and something that might have been awe. "Delilah," she said, her voice thick with emotion. This whole time you let me think you were struggling." "I was struggling," I said quietly. "Just not in the way you imagined." Her tears came then, angry and proud simultaneously. "Why didn't you trust me? I'm your sister. I worried about you every single day, thinking you were grinding yourself to death for nothing." We moved to the windows overlooking the city, away from the crowd's energy. The lights below sparkled like scattered diamonds, each one a story, a dream, a possibility. "I had to do it alone first," I explained, watching our reflections merge with the cityscape. "If I'd told anyone, even you, it would have changed everything. The doubt, the questions, the advice, it would have made me second-guess every decision. I needed to prove it to myself before I could prove it to anyone else." Claire was quiet for a long moment, then squeezed my hand. "You were never stuck anywhere," she said softly. "You were just building your wings in silence. For the first time in years, someone in my family truly saw me. Not the facade, not the role I played, but the actual person I'd fought to become." Later that evening, Marcus pulled me aside with an update I hadn't asked for but somehow expected. "Carson and Elise finalized their divorce last week," he said quietly. "Their lawyers are fighting over debts now, not assets. Carson had sent one email to my public address, I was wrong. 3 words, no elaboration. I deleted it unread, seeing only the preview. There was nothing he could say that would matter now. Elise had apparently disappeared to some mountain retreat in Colorado, posting vague quotes about finding yourself in new beginnings. They'd become cautionary tales in business schools, Marcus informed me. Case studies in arrogance, in underestimating competition, in the danger of dismissing people based on assumptions. But standing there in that ballroom surrounded by success stories and second chances, I realized they'd become something else too, irrelevant. As the evening wound down, I returned to my office 1 floor above the celebration. The sounds of the party filtered up through the floor, muffled but present. I stood at my window looking out at the city I'd conquered in silence. Tomorrow would bring 3 new hostile takeover defenses to design, 2 initiative interviews with women whose eyes would hold that familiar mixture of exhaustion and determination, and a meeting about expanding internationally. My reflection in the window showed tired eyes but satisfied ones. The woman they said was stuck in a little office now owned the entire building. The woman they'd mocked for never rising had built something that would outlast their memory. The city lights below twinkled like promises waiting to be kept. Each one could be another company saved, another entrepreneur funded, another person who'd been dismissed getting their chance to build something undeniable. The view from the 42nd floor wasn't just about height. It was about perspective. And from here, the future looked absolutely unforgettable. If this story of powerful revenge and poetic justice gave you chills, tap that like button right now. My favorite part was when Delilah walked into that boardroom, owning the moment they never saw coming. What was your favorite scene? Tell me in the comments below. And don't miss more stories of women who rise from silence to power. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.